Let's see here. Let's just make sure everything sounds good, and then we'll get going, and then we'll keep moving, you know? Just make sure everything sounds all right, and then we'll get going. I think everything's okay. So we'll get rid of that window, find it right here, and share it on YouTube, or no, excuse me, on Twitter, and then we'll get going. Okay. Almost there. Okie dokie. So I think that everything is sufficiently shared. And so since everything is sufficiently shared, I think it's time to get the show, as they say, on the road. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whoever you are, wherever you are. My name is Dr. Patrick Lockwood. In this case, I'm just Patrick. Please don't sue me, etc., etc. This is yet another episode of UnShrink Me. And I am so grateful to be here. Thank you all for coming to show up and chat and listen and talk and share. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. So thank you for being here. And I hope today we have a good chat, you know. So today's episode is going to have a couple of, I think, important and somewhat complicated topics. So please bear with us. It might require a little explanation, but I think it'll be fun. So please stick around and have some fun. Okay? As always, this is a weekly podcast. The UnShrink Me podcast is a weekly show specifically dedicated to the consumers of mental health services. This is a show that is all about talking about ideas in mental health, psychiatry, psychology, coaching, counseling, and all those related things, and the research associated with those things, so that patients, clients, etc. can get the most out of their mental health services. So this is me publicly critiquing, discussing, exploring ideas so that if you're out there seeking out couples counseling, therapy, coaching, whatever it is, you can get the most out of it. Because to me, one of the great sins of the profession is pretending that we know what we're doing, when in reality, in many cases, we don't actually know what we're doing. So the whole spirit of this podcast is to critique ideas, and often these ideas are found on Twitter. So you'll be seeing me looking at tweets and reading tweets and discussing what people say who are usually in the mental health space, and discussing those ideas and critiquing them. Less so the people, more so the ideas. So if you are new to the show, please like, share, and subscribe. I would appreciate it. If you are new to the show, also find me on Twitter. My handle is at AlobhaPatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK, AlobhaPatrick. And that's where I'll be tweeting and posting about live during the show. And as always, this show is not NOT, brought to you by Celsius, although I love it and I'm appreciative of it and grateful for it. It tastes good, it gives me energy, etc. So on today's show, we have a couple of really interesting and important topics, so please bear with us. It might take a little exposition, but we will get there, and hopefully it'll be interesting and fun. So today, we are going to talk about the concept of healing and what healing actually means. And then we'll talk about Freud, because who doesn't love talking about Freud in the year of our Lord 2026? And finally, we will talk about what it means to have an agenda in clinical mental health services. So those are our three main topics. Other things might show up, especially for people in the chat. If you are sharing and discussing and talking about things, I will try to address whatever's happening in the chat. Thank you for coming to show up in the chat. So, as always, I like to start with a bit of a softball, something somewhat easy to ease into the episode. And so today I'd like to talk about my buddy Nick Tabor. If you are not on Twitter, I hope you join Twitter so you can join the conversation, because I think the more of us that are in the conversation, the better. However, my buddy Nick Tabor, who is kind of in the critical of psychiatry, psychology camp, put out a post earlier today that I think is worth exploring. So let's start with that as the first topic today, as the introductory topic. Okay, let me retweet it real quick. Okay. So about 5 hours ago, Nick Tabor, his handle, if you are on Twitter, is at NICKTABER. He said the following, and I quote, excuse me, "The relationship between a mental health professional and a child is, in many cases, an abusive relationship at its core." That's a complicated sentence, so I'll be breaking that down in a sec. He says, in almost all cases, it's initiated by a third party, like a parent or school, not by the child. The professional is hired to fix behaviors and attitudes that the third party, the parent or school, finds inconvenient. The child can't say no. He says, if a child is restless, defiant, or unhappy in a setting they find oppressive, they get coerced or manipulated into altering this and are gaslit about what they are experiencing. So, as always, Nick says a number of fairly controversial things in one little tweet. So, let me see if I can unpack a few of these and we can have a bit of a conversation about it, because I think it's important. I also think it's one of Nick's hobby horses, is kids in therapy. So let's go back to the very first sentence that he said, because I think this tweet has a very important preamble, which is the relationship between a child and a mental health professional is, in many cases, abusive. At its core, he said. So when he means at its core, he means non-consensually, I believe. So it's coercion. It's forced on the person. And let me be 100% clear that if you are mandated to treatment, if you are forced into treatment, like at gunpoint or else, then it has the capacity to be abusive much more easily. And in many cases, I agree, is abusive, because not only is there a power differential between the professional and the child in this example, but also there's a mandatory nature to it. You're being forced to do something. And that is in and of itself on the oppressive side of things. Now, that's different than ordinary social pressure, which can sometimes be seen as oppressive, but ordinary social pressure is not. That's just life, and you should figure it out and get used to it. But the fact that you're forced to do something, as in at gunpoint almost, that is a problem. And I think kids are coerced into therapy all the time, and most kids who are in therapy probably shouldn't be in therapy. I'll say that again. Most kids that are in therapy probably shouldn't be in therapy. It probably should be the parents who should be getting some specific feedback, not the kids. Second statement he made, in almost all cases, the therapy for the kid is initiated by the school, not by the child. That, in and of itself, is very problematic, I would say. And so, I definitely agree with Nick that it's very, 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 very problematic that the school, a third party, is making this happen for the kid, not the individual themselves. The problem is, most kids who are struggling will never really have the chance to speak up for themselves, even in the best of circumstances and situations. So we are in a bit of a catch-22. If a kid is struggling, how else will they be identified? So that one I don't know about. I'm a little more conflicted, comparatively speaking. And third, the point that Nick often makes, which I don't want to push on too much, but I want to say a few things about it. First and foremost, it's very important to be clear, in my opinion, that if a child is restless, defiant, or unhappy in a setting they find oppressive, they get coerced into therapy. So I agree that, kids are often in systems and circumstances that are, at least at minimum, not good for their mental health. But also, a lot of kids are literally in oppressive situations. They're in abusive families. They're in school systems with negligent teachers, or just garden variety bullying where no one is helping them. And that happens a lot. And so what I would say is it's very, very important. Hey, Phil, thanks for joining the chat. It's very, very important to be clear that sometimes kids are quite literally, I would say, abused in schools, in families, and they have no help. And so do they get forced into therapy, or do they talk to a supportive other adult? Because usually it's their peers can't help them. So we have this problem of like, what do we do with kids who are genuinely struggling? So Nick, all I would say is let's shoot for a little more nuance, because I agree that many times kids are in difficult situations. And as Phil just said in the chat, there's this problem with this concept called ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. And for those of you who don't know, in the DSM-5 TR, oppositional defiant disorder is this very flimsy diagnosis where an individual, usually a child or adolescent, who is irritable and defiant and hostile and all these things, but not maybe physically abusive in many cases. These individuals usually have crappy parents. And now maybe they're crappy parents because the parents are so busy and stressed and all these things, and fair enough, but figure out how to do your job better. But 9.99999 times out of 10, if you fix the parents, then the ODD disappears in like a month or two. It's actually genuinely not rocket science to fix ODD. So ODD is not a real diagnosis in many of my colleagues' opinions, and also in my opinion. However, that doesn't mean that there's no benefit for therapy for those young people who are struggling. So Nick, thank you for the grist for the mill. I just want to push back and say, maybe just a skosh, a soupçon more nuance, and your life will get easier. I hope. Okay. So the three main topics today is what exactly is healing? How does healing actually work? The second topic is Freud being ahead of his time. And the third topic is having an agenda in therapy. That'll be the light one that we end today's chat with. And so let's start with Freud, because I think it's always fun to talk about the concept of Freud in these chats. So I'm going to retweet someone real quick, and I'm going to talk about what this person said, and then I'm just going to vamp for a little bit. Okay, before I do that though, we're going to talk about one of my chatters' comments. So Jonathan, one of my colleagues online, says, in the education agency where I work, what we see often are our parents who are abusive and school staff who are relatively powerless to help change the family. So to your point, Jonathan, about what Nick is discussing, the point you're making is extremely important, which is in many school systems, school counselors, teachers, principals literally are in, as Jonathan just said, this is something he's saying in the chat right now, school counselors, teachers, parents, school therapists are in a catch-22 between wanting to help the kids with their situation, but being limited to what they can do within the school system because the parents have little to no motivation for change. So as much as I think the school system sucks in many ways, especially when they're trying to practice mental health and they don't know what they're doing, which I think Jonathan probably would agree with, I would also say that it's really, really important to be clear that the people who are actually in these systems are relatively powerless. Because the problem is, although you have 8 hours a day with this kid to be a good influence, a good teacher, a good counselor, a good principal, it's also absolutely the case that if you're going back to a verbally abusive home, a neglectful home, sometimes that's a reportable thing, but often it's not. And so that kid is just kind of screwed because trying to intervene on the parents is not something the schools have authority to do. And I think, Nick Tabor, you probably would agree that you don't want the schools to have authority over the parents. I don't think you want the schools to have more power. I don't want schools to have more power also. So we're, as Jonathan said, in a really tough position with trying to help kids that are struggling. We don't want the schools to have more power because they suck at using it usually. And the parents are sucking at home, but no one can influence them. So the question is, how do we help that kid who's struggling because the parents suck and the schools suck? So sometimes people create nonprofits to help kids. Sometimes private practice therapists and interventionists can help kids. Sometimes it's a third party that needs to be involved that's rational and understands all the complicated dynamics. And if I were to go just a little further down the road here about this topic, let me say something quite controversial, which is, in the words of our buddy Murray Bowen, we might need to stabilize these very six systems, parents and schools, with a triangle, such as an outside interventionist or therapist who has ethics, who has a profit incentive, because the better they do, the more people get helped and get out of their care and do better in school, for instance. That would be a good use of a triangle in Bowenian terms. Phil also put in the chat here that 30% of people diagnosed with ODD keep it into adulthood. If that's true, I have no clue what that's based on, but if you want to share a resource in the chat, I'd love it, Phil. The reason they probably keep it into adulthood is because, genuinely speaking, their family never gets better. Their crappy parents stay crappy. Jonathan also says, your statements about school and ODD are 100%. Educators understand limitations of their role and don't want the school to be a therapy entity. They want to be an education development entity. Schools should just be teaching you curriculum. They shouldn't be trying to make you a pro-social creature, because that's impossible. At least that's my take. So, for what it's worth, for whatever it's worth for anyone watching and listening, let me just say that the school mental health of kids problem is complicated, because to the extent that the schools suck at doing their job, that's one limitation and one problematic dynamic. But to the extent that parents are sucking and failing their kids, that's a second interactive problem with the school problem. So kids are stuck between two problematic dynamics: crappy parents of whatever kind or type, and crappy schools of whatever kind or type. And these two problems kids don't know what to do with, literally. And school teachers, in many cases, are just trying to do the bare minimum correctly, and God bless them. And many parents, by the way, are just trying to do the bare minimum correctly, and God bless them as well. It's really hard to be a good teacher, and it's really hard to be a good parent. Very hard to do. So I'm not trying to say that all parents suck and all schools suck. I'm trying to say that it's a really complicated problem, and so perhaps a third party might stabilize these things to help reform them. So Bowen might be the best choice. A healthy triangle, as it were. Just Me showed up to the chat here. Thank you for showing up and chatting. Said, it's rare for kids to meet care plan goals. Correct, statistically speaking. Many just stop showing up and it's a mess. Many are in services for years, 100%. And the reason's because we have this complicated school dynamics and complicated family dynamics. And so parents are ignorant often. Parents are overworked and stressed and all these things, and they suck at doing their job as parents. Sometimes they suck really bad and are abusive and neglectful. Sometimes they just suck in ordinary ways. Same thing with school teachers and school counselors. Sometimes they suck in ordinary ways, and that's hard for these kids who are vulnerable. And sometimes they suck in extraordinary ways. They're abusive, neglectful, pedophiles, all these terrible things. So the fact that there's a spectrum of suck, let's say, is the problem, dear Nick Tabor. It's a complicated interactional problem that I think only an outside party, a third person, to use Bowen's triangle idea, could probably help stabilize the problem and help resolve the problem. That's my belief. And I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it would take lots of time and money to do correctly. And most school districts are not going to pay for some outside interventionist or therapist or family therapist or whatever it is to fix these things, because most schools want to do it themselves. And most schools think their school therapists or counselors should be able to do this shit, and they cannot do it. They're not good at it. They're not trained to do it. They're trained to work in their system. So anyways, I hope this all makes sense. I hope that if you're stuck with how to be a good parent or how to be a better teacher or administrator, hit me up on Twitter. My handle is at alobhapatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. I will try to help point you in the direction of qualified people who might be able to give you a helpful outside perspective in your local school district. And if I can give you some feedback too, I certainly will try to do my best, etc. All right. I think that's enough of that for the time being. We can always come back to more school and kid mental health tweets. Most kids that are diagnosed with things don't actually have a real diagnosis. It's mostly a situational thing that's poorly diagnosed. So let's stop pathologizing kids who are in shitty circumstances. That's just me. All right, let's talk about Freud. We're going to switch gears somewhat radically, actually. And I think that this might be a little controversial, so bear with us. But I think it might be helpful. I think it might be maybe a little enlightening for some people. So, here we go. There's this person, another clinician that I interact with on Twitter, and their handle is Catbush, and their actual technical handle is at Feisty Kitty Pie. That's at FeistykittyPie. So let me retweet this real quick. Okay. So here is what Feisty Kitty Pie, aka Catbush, said a day ago, yesterday. And I quote, "Another way, Freud was way ahead of us. Instead of consoling or cheering up the melancholic person who thinks he or she is a piece of shit, he says, no, we should take that utterance, that I'm a piece of shit, very seriously and find out how this person has been a piece of shit, in parentheses, in their own mind." So, in Therapy Land, which is the world's worst theme park ever created, in Therapy Land, the world's worst theme park, there are many camps, many schools of thought, many terrible rides you can go on, where people think you should validate people when they feel bad, you should normalize how bad they feel. And one thing that's missing from a lot of these conversations is this very important idea that human beings are complicated. So if you yourself right now are listening or watching, and you're in therapy or you're in counseling or coaching or whatever it is, I want you to hear this very clearly, that you are complicated. You are complicated in various ways. You're complicated because of your culture. You're complicated because of your biology. You're complicated because of your personality differences and your personality style. You're complicated because of your intellectual gifts and your intellectual deficits. And just those things I listed alone make you an infinitely complex creature. But then there's what you're consciously aware of, what you think about that you can pay attention to and remember all day. But then there's your unconscious, the things that go bump in the night in your brain that you can't see actively. So there's your conscious mind and there's your unconscious mind, your quote unquote unconscious wishes, as it were, and your beliefs about yourself that were formed sometimes very early in life before you could even talk. At the age of like 1 or 2, for instance. So I want to talk about that complexity right now because I think it's important. And although the tweet that I just read you might sound silly to some degree, I want to take it very seriously because many people in therapy stay stuck in therapy because they don't recognize that their unconscious mind might be at odds with their conscious mind. Which would be completely normal, by the way. That conflict is an ordinary state of being for all human beings. If you read the motivational interviewing literature, it says ambivalence is the most normal thing on the planet, right? So the MI people agree with Freud that conscious and unconscious conflicts are normal. That's the normal operating way of functioning. Everyone agrees, basically. They just might not use Freudian language in modern terms. So, let's talk about this concept of conflict real quick. Some people who present with symptoms of depression, low mood, hopelessness, so-called low self-esteem, lack of energy, things like that, a lot of times when people are down on themselves, to just summarize, it's actually not because they're misinterpreting the world in kind of the Albert Ellis sense of things. A lot of people are down on themselves because they have true beliefs about themselves, about how big a piece of shit they actually are. Now, those beliefs about how terrible a person they are in conflict with the conscious data of the way they show up in the world. Because if you have to use CBT language, if you have a core negative belief that you're a bad person, but then you go out in the real world and you're like not punching people in the face all the time, not cursing at people all the time, not picking fights all the time, not stepping on people, not being wildly selfish at the supermarket, at the gas station, at whatever, then yeah, you have a bunch of conscious data that says, I'm actually not a piece of shit. But then what if you learned something when you were a kid, right? What if you grew up in an abusive home when you're in middle school or elementary school and your parents are yelling and screaming at each other and yelling and screaming at you, and you internalize that as a little kid, that you are bad, you are fundamentally flawed and broken. And what if that happens for years? What if you're in an abusive home for a decade as a kid, from age 6 to 16? That certainly will scar you in a way that other types of abuse or neglect or trauma won't. It's wildly different than being in a car accident, for instance. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, you grow up in a home with this very obvious form of emotional abuse, where you're being literally told you're a piece of shit, being yelled at, screamed at multiple days of the week, most days of the week, by the people that are supposed to care about you, your parents. Then you will certainly, more often than not, probably, internalize a sense of I am fundamentally bad, right? So then no matter what good behavior you do, you have this core negative belief that operates in your unconscious, in the back of your mind, that says you're fundamentally bad. And so a lot of people will be mystified that I can't believe that you see yourself as such a bad person. Why do you not care about yourself? You do all these good things. You're such a nice person. In fact, many people who grow up with a lot of abuse will overcompensate even and do extra nice, extra good things. They'll donate a lot of money and give to charity and volunteer a lot and be extra nice and agreeable and all sorts of stuff. And all of that can be an overcompensation for how bad of a person you think you are. So in reality, as opposed to trying to console someone that, no, you're not a bad person, maybe a good thing to do in therapy is actually to figure out why you think you're a bad person and how you learned that you are a bad person. Club Exile, just joined the chat here, glad you're here, said you have to learn to not internalize it. A strong knowledge and sense of self can help, for sure. Well, here's the problem, Club Exile, is that when you're a tiny little kid, let's say at the age of 6, I don't know if the average 6-year-old would be able to not internalize it to some degree. Now, some kids might not if they're built differently, but maybe a lot of kids would. So it's complicated. The other problem is this, and this is something that I want to say very carefully because I don't want to be accused of just being nasty for the sake of being nasty. Just so we're clear. So I want to say this very clearly so everyone can hear it and understand it. Sometimes you actually are a piece of shit and you don't understand it. So let me just be very clear about that. So when Feisty Kitty Pie said, we should take that utterance very seriously and find out how this person has been a piece of shit in their own mind. Many people walk around all day as not evil people. However, even though they're not evil, they're like not harming people all day, every day in the worst possible way or something. But a lot of people are actively violating their principles all day in little ways. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? So let's just say that you have the value, you have the principle in your mind that you really care a lot about telling the truth. Maybe telling the truth is extremely important to you, right? But maybe you choose to lie all day. And lying all day is eroding at your soul, so to speak, metaphorically, your mind, your unconscious. And so maybe you have this principle to tell the truth because telling the truth is what's good for you. It makes you feel good as a person. But, if you're in a job where you should lie all day, like being a salesperson and all those things, if you have a deeply held principle that you're violating all day long, then although you're not punching people in the face and torturing babies and killing the innocent and all these things, you're violating an important principle all day. And so you actually are a piece of shit in your own mind. And this is something that, acceptance and commitment therapy, aka ACT, gets correct, which is a lot of people have unnecessary conflict, unnecessary sadness and depression and self-hatred because they're actually not living in alignment with their principles and their values. And so many people who look miserable are actually reasonably so miserable from the point of view of psychoanalytic thought and the point of acceptance and commitment therapy. Because a lot of people are pieces of shit in the sense that they're violating their deeply held principles all day. If you have a deeply held principle that you should be considerate of other people, let's say you score very, very high on trait conscientiousness, but maybe you work in a very sick industry, like the drug rehab industry, where being greedy and corrupt is what gets you to have a paycheck. You might do things, for instance, that violate that principle of being very conscientious and considerate and being ethical because you're trying to keep yourself alive and even keep your patients alive and in treatment, for instance. You might break the law. You might commit insurance fraud, as many people do in Rehabistan. And it might eat away at your soul. And you are being a piece of shit and violating your deeply held principle of living in alignment with your ethics and doing the right thing, for instance, because you score, let's say, in the 80th or above percentile of trait conscientiousness. It does happen all the time. People put themselves in double binds all the time. They have X stated principle and they live in Y stated life or career, and they're miserable because of it. And they've earned that misery. They're acting like pieces of shit because they chose this career, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people have unconscious wishes or needs, or to be more, practical about it, they have values that they're not living in alignment with, and they're miserable. If you know you do good work and you've not asked for a raise and you feel miserable because of it, then you're violating some important principle, and you should feel bad about the fact that you're not getting a raise because you're being a piece of shit by not asking for a raise, for instance. Now, if you're being grandiose and entitled, that's different. Club Exile says, I find it very difficult to violate a genuine principle. Usually if I can violate a principle, it's because it's not as much of one as I may have thought it was. I think for some people, they're built in such a way, as you just said, Club Exile. I think a lot of people, maybe if they're more conscientious, for instance, they might less often violate their deeply held principles. Though I would say all of us are hypocrites to some degree, to some significant degree. The idea that we're never hypocrites, I think, is silly. I think all of us are. And so what I would say is, I think there's ordinary hypocrisy, which might be death by a thousand cuts for some people. And I think there's sometimes extraordinary hypocrisy because we have unconscious conflicts. Let me say this again. Sometimes we put ourselves in hypocritical positions because of unconscious conflicts. And we all have unconscious conflicts. The goal is to figure them out and try to live better every day if we can. Sometimes it takes some time and perspective or outside eyes, like a therapist, to figure out those unconscious conflicts. Sometimes we don't need them. Sometimes we need good friends or a pastor or whatever it is, or a spouse. Anyways, So all this is to say is that Freud was absolutely correct that we have unconscious conflicts. Freud was absolutely correct that if we think we're a piece of shit, sometimes it's based upon real beliefs that are valid because we actually aren't living a principled life that matters to us. Sometimes we have an unconscious belief that is in conflict with a conscious belief. And that's something we should be interrogating and investigating and exploring so we can get out of ambivalence about that and into action about something that actually matters to us. So, yes, I would say Freud was correct. I hope that all made sense, and I welcome any and all pushback. Thank you, Club Exile, for your pushback, by the way. I really appreciate it, because it is complicated. There's actually a really, I think, helpful example that's about to be fully explained here in the chat, so we're going to give it just a second. I'm going to take a sip here. Okay, so one of my buddies, Jonathan, is in the chat here. He says, here's one that anyone can get caught in at Club Exile. When a loved one dies, I may get caught between the need to move on with life and provide for self and family, but get stuck in grief because it feels disloyal to recover. So I think grief is an excellent example of this problem, Jonathan. Thank you for sharing. We might feel like a real piece of shit if we try to move on with our lives because we have all these grief-related feelings, this loss, this melancholia, this mourning, where we have an obligation to the person who's now dead and gone, and we want to keep fulfilling it because that person matters so much to us. And so in the spirit of grieving, we try to keep that relationship alive in some important way. But also, we have real people right here, right now that need us to not be distracted by our grief, that need us to be moving on. And so we might feel terrible in great conflict because we love that person who's dead now, but we want to move on. And what do we do? And how do we move on in a way that honors both needs? That's actually not easy for the average person. And we shouldn't moralize it. I agree with you, Club Exile. The problem is sometimes people's conflict around grief does involve morals. So it's complicated. All right, let's get to the topic du jour today, which I think is important. And thank you all for chatting about this particular topic too, because this has been great so far. So thank you for being here and chatting. I love this. I hope to see you every week. So here is the topic du jour today. I think this is important. And I think this is one of those like pop psychology woo-woo things that we should really be super clear about. Because I believe many people in the therapy professions, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, LPCCs, MFTs, etc., not just life coaches and gurus and pastoral counselors and priests, all those people are gross too, often because they're gurus. But licensed clinicians also fall into this guru trap. So let me talk about the most confused and misunderstood word in the world of therapy. In therapy land, the world's worst theme park, here is the most toxic word that I can think of. And it's the word healing. Healing is a word that can promote the most toxic behavior on behalf of both patients, but also therapists and coaches and counselors and gurus and priests and all these things. Because healing is this pseudo-spiritual thing that everyone has such vague notions about. And so in order to get rid of all the vagueness, the ambiguity around the concept of healing, I did myself a little experiment earlier this week, which I think went really well, honestly. And I just want to say right now, to everyone who follows me and interacts with me on Twitter, who, especially those of you who are therapists, thank you so much for chiming in because you're helping everyone, I think, today. So let me retweet my little experiment so you know what I'm talking about. This was yesterday or 2 days ago. Okay, so this is a complicated one. And it might take a while, maybe even another episode, but we'll see. We'll start the process and see where it goes, okay? So, here's what I said. Yesterday, I said, "Dear therapists, what do you specifically mean when you say the word heal?" As in, I want to help them heal. And so I think I got a few thousand views, and I got lots of really good comments. Some of them are really funny, and some of them are really practical. And so I want to walk through a number of the comments, because if you're a patient, if you're in a rehab right now, if you're in couples counseling, if you're in all these things, I want you to really understand what healing might be for you. And I think there are some technical, practical ways of looking at it, so you're not in therapy forever. I do not want anyone, me personally, Patrick Lockwood, just me, I don't want anyone in forever therapy, because I think forever therapy is unethical, personally. You can fire me, you can sue me, I don't honestly care. But I think if you're on a never-ending quest to heal, and if you don't know this reference, I'm so sorry for you, but I think it's a phenomenal reference. Back in the early 2000s, there was this really raunchy comedy show called Drawn Together. And on this raunchy animated comedy show called Drawn Together, there are a variety of like mainstream video game characters that were all obviously trademarked and copyrighted. So they made fake versions of these trademarked copyrighted characters. And one of them that's supposed to be from The Legend of Zelda, who's supposed to be Link, Link, his name in the episode, in the show is Xander, Xandir. And he looks like this gay twink elf thing. And the whole joke is, if you ever watch, hey Ryan, hey Pet, hey Ryan, hey Inspired by Reason. So if you've ever watched the show Drawn Together, which I encourage you to watch at least one episode so you know what I'm talking about at least. So one of the characters they're parodying in this comedy TV show, comic animated show, is supposed to be Link from The Legend of Zelda, the video game. And the fake version is named Xander. And Xander has this catchphrase that he's on a never-ending quest to save his girlfriend, because that's what's happening in the Legend of Zelda video game series anyways. And like the tongue-in-cheek joke is that he's actually gay as hell. And he's so gay, and it's so obvious to everyone that he's gay, but he's like in denial about it. And I think that so many therapists are on this never-ending quest to save their patient, when in reality they like a special audience. It serves the therapist, not the patient. That's a long-winded way of saying a lot of therapists are unethical and narcissistic and really just keep working with people for money and for the special attention so they can prove that they're an awesome healer and will keep going deeper and deeper and deeper because deeper is better or some shit like that. And so look up Drawn Together, hilarious TV show, very funny, and look up the Xander character who's on this BS never-ending quest to save his girlfriend. And that's most therapists. A lot of therapists are on this never-ending quest to fix their patients, which is bullshit. So all that is a preamble to say healing is a very toxic word in therapy because a lot of people have very mistaken, non-practical notions of what it means to heal. So I asked therapists this week, I said, what do you specifically mean when you said the word heal? And so many people showed up and gave me some really cool answers. So Grant Brenner, who's a psychiatrist online, who is a lot of fun, he said that healing from a medical perspective is fibroblast migration into wounds, because that's what happens when your skin heals. But he has no clue what it means for mental health. One of my other colleagues online, Soad Tabrizi, says it's when you find peace. And she said, in practical terms, that means being truly comfortable in the way that you walk through life. Now, the challenge is if you're honest about it. And my response to Soad was, I don't care if someone's comfortable with their life. I care if they're actually in alignment with their values and achieve their goals. That's exactly what I meant. Another person gave me a Buddhist perspective, which is just to observe myself regularly. Healing is to observe myself regularly without reacting. So a healed person is a person who can observe their experiences without reacting. So it's like being mindfully non-attached and non-judgmental. That's not a bad definition of healing. It's hard to do, though, because non-judgment and non-attachment take a lot of effort. Then there's an ad. Thank you, X. Thank you, Twitter, for the ad. Kevin, aka Plant Dandy, said, I have no clue what it means. And I also said, I don't really know what it means myself. Dr. Graham Webb said, the concept of healing is absurdly comical to me. We're all going to die eventually, so does the healing journey end with a spiritual enlightened death? The reduction of suffering prior to death? Bucket list done? Etc.? And I said, I have no clue. It's... Brian Meyerhofer said, I hope I said your name correctly, Brian. He said, healing is integrating a fragmented self into wholeness. And what he means by that is taking sub-personalities, pieces of yourself that you don't pay attention to or can't see consciously, and trying to integrate them into your conscious awareness. So healing is an integrated self-concept. So far, just to reiterate, we've got a number of definitions. So Brian's definition is having an integrated self-concept. That's healing. And then Kevin Plant Daddy says, I have no clue. Shivani says to have the capacity to observe yourself without reacting and attaching. So that's the Buddhist perspective on healing, is to be so non-reactive and non-attached that you can just observe yourself. Soad Tabrizi says to be truly comfortable in the way that we walk through life. Okay. And Grant made a joke about healing wounds. And Jeffrey Miller says to process the memory and remove the feeling. And Jeffrey, when I prompted Jeffrey and I said, what does it mean to process something? And he says, he said something about watching one of his videos, which I don't have time to do. Patrick Crow said healing is when you are in remission from symptoms, which is a very, I'd say, a scandalous saying for many of the people online, because healing is about, like, you know, being symptom free, basically, or having subclinical symptoms, which Metabolism Plus Therapy also said cessation of symptoms. Dr. Andrew Perry said, for me, it's about creating a newly self-determined life. So you're healed if you're able to act differently and create a more self-determined, as in not reactionary, but more intentionally created life. So, and a couple of other jokes showed up in the chat. So, dear chat, what do you think about all these definitions of healing? Because I think there's many interesting, sometimes conflicting, sometimes not conflicting models of healing discussed in these posts. Club Exile says some of that is the medical model. Right, so cessation of symptoms or being subclinical is definitely the medical model of healing. I don't know that I like that definition of quote-unquote healing. Excuse me, because generally speaking, if you're just subclinical, if you have like just not enough symptoms, you might still be very, very hurt or struggling with hurt. So I don't know that I like the medical approach to healed or healing. What about the rest of you? Do others of you have thoughts about healing? I think of all the definitions that people gave me, if I were to combine a few of these that seem maybe workable. Let's take Shivani's definition. Observing, if I'm healed, so Shivani says, if I'm healed or in the process of healing, I'm more and more able to observe myself without reacting. So that's a very Buddhist or mindfulness-based definition of healing. So the more healed you are, the more you can notice what's happening without letting your reaction, when you're noticing, take over your mind, right? So a more healed person is less reactive and less hijacked by their reactions. To me, if we're talking super practically in the simplest possible terms, I think the more healed somebody is, the less they're reactive, number one, about that original topic that made them reactive. And they're less hijacked when they are reacting, which means they have more metacognition left over to do something. Club Exile says, I like the one related to self-determination. I would reference healing to the client's own therapeutic goals. Right, it's their goal, not ours. Club Exile also says, I observe and react. They both have value to me. Okay. So maybe we can combine those two definitions, right? So maybe we can take this kind of Buddhist mindfulness kind of definition of healing, which is if you're on the spectrum of more healed, as it's a process and not like a one and done thing, like a wound on your hand, psychological healing probably isn't like a wound on your hand. If you cut your hand, or my cat scratches my hand or something, that wound, thanks to Dr. Grant Brenner, there will be new fibroblast cells that come and fill in the gaps where the injury is, and eventually the skin will look normal, like it used to look. It will be the same or somewhat different, but basically the same as it used to be. In psychological healing, there's not the same kind of wound, even if there's trauma, there's not the same kind of wound, because trauma is not an injury. Trauma is a reactionary style, as it were. So the healing that people do when they're hurt or traumatized or etc. isn't like you have a hole in your hand. It's like you have a reaction pattern that's not helpful for you, a sensitivity that's not helpful for you, right? So I think the idea of combining the self-determination definition plus the mindfulness definition might be a nice, coherent, simple definition of healing. So it might be the case that when someone is on the road to being more healed, let's say progressively over time more healed, it's a combination of three things. Number one, being just less reactive to the thing that originally made you super reactive. So like, I'm reactive to loud noises because when I was yelled at as a kid, it made me feel unsafe, right? So I'm less reactive to loud noises. But number two, I'm more able to have metacognition. I'm able to notice without judgment and without attaching. So number one, less reactive. Number two, noticing without judgment, without attachment. And number three, as Club Exile said, maybe it's like you're more able to act in a way that has agency. I'm able to be more intentional and functional in the way that I show up in the world as opposed to more reactionary and out of control. Inspired by Reason said, surely, don't call me Shirley, I'm kidding. Inspired by Reason said, surely a definition of healing wouldn't lead to both individually or societally catastrophic experiences, right? So like, are you so healed that you let the world burn, basically? You're so like non-attached and so zen that, the world can burn around me and it's fine. Is that what you mean, inspired by Reason? Because if that's what you mean, I think we should talk about it. Because it is complicated, admittedly. And while they're typing and reacting, I'll just make sure, I'm going to double check that I didn't miss any non-kidding definitions. A lot of people said I'm not quite sure what it means, by the way. One of the things that I love about the responses is a lot of people genuinely don't understand what healing actually means. So, inspired by Reason, are you saying that generally speaking, healing is less about being like detached from the world? It's more about, being able to be agentic in the world and be a pro-social part of the world, perhaps, maybe. Maybe a symptom. If we were to talk about the symptoms of being more healed, you have more internal locus of control, as Club Exile has said, and you're more capable of participating in the world in a useful way, right? Jonathan Cogburn just said, amen to metacognition, having increased awareness and control of boundaries and structures and ability to change them without external support. So more agency, basically. You're less reactive to the outside world. And by the way, when I say less reactive in like the Buddhist sense, it's not like you're so zen that nothing makes you feel anything. No Buddhist would say that. The idea is you're still going to have feelings and reactions. The question is, number one, are the reactions going to be extreme and outsized? But number two, are you going to be able to act agentically? Are you going to have intentional ability to function, or are you going to be functioning in a reactionary, reflexive kind of way? So we're less reflexive, more intentional, and we're just less reactive in general, I think. I think, Jonathan, that's what you're talking about. So more internal locus of control. Inspired by Reason saying something really important, so I want to make sure I give it its proper time. He said, there's plenty of people who are of high agency who are not pro-social. Like if someone comes into therapy with an antisocial agenda, is it therapeutic to assist them in their goals? At some point, there's a place for judgment about people's goals. I think that every therapist who's ethical should certainly be able to say and do whatever they need to do to work with people in a way that's ethical and does not violate their principles. So if you don't want to work with people who have antisocial goals, that's totally good, and I support that, and I respect that. And I think a lot of people probably would agree with that, right? So I'm not saying that, being a good therapist, especially as it relates to the concept of healing, is just do whatever the patient wants. Because I have never just done whatever the patient wants, right? That's not what the solution-focused world says. That's not what the MI world says at all. It is more like, if you have a goal to quote unquote heal a hurt or a trauma or whatever, then is your reaction to that experience going to help you feel more in charge, less reactive, more aware without judgment and attachment, and more agentic in life that's in a self-sustaining, self-supportive way? In fact, what I would love for all people in therapy is to create habits and mindsets that are self-sustaining, that allow you to function without needing me. That'd be awesome, I think. That's actually my goal most of the time. So, I don't know. I think it's complicated. I think it's extremely complicated. I think it's situation dependent, but I don't think I generally believe our ethics code lets us work with people who are trying to be better serial killers or something. Like we have a duty to warn, right? We're not here to help people become better child abusers or elder abusers. We have laws and rules that say we're not supposed to do that. So, I think there are practical ethical realities where we don't just support anyone's goals. Like, I've worked in Rehabistan for a very long time. I don't believe that I've ever encouraged people to be better drug addicts or use drugs more problematically in my life. I've explored their motivations to keep using drugs. I've explored their motivations to use more drugs and what it does for them and what it won't do for them. In motivational interviewing, we have this skill called a decisional balance, where we look at the pros and cons of both doing the behavior more and doing it less. And that's a pretty ethical way of handling antisocial goals in my experience. So, lots of skills out there if you need them. So yeah, healing, what is it? Based upon the conversation in the chat here, and based upon a lot of the responses to my tweets, it looks like it's some combination of self-determination. The more healed you are, the more you can act with agency. You're not being reactive, you're being, let's say, proactive and intentional. That's one symptom of being more healed. Another symptom of being more healed is that you have more metacognition, more awareness without reaction, awareness without judgment, awareness without attachment. And a third symptom of more healed is less reactive. Not zero reaction, just less. Less reactive enough to function better in your life. Whatever that means. So I think that's a 3-part definition of healing based upon what we've talked about in the chat here today and what was posted under my tweet. I think that seems fair. I don't know that it's maybe not specific enough for some people, and I would love to hear your comments. Let me know what you think. But we're kind of at the end of our time here. And so we got to get going, unfortunately. I really do appreciate all of you coming out to chat. and talk and agree and disagree and explore with me in this conversation today. And I really, and Inspired by Reason says, I'll add the pro-sociality component. Absolutely. I hope most of what you do is pro-social for sure. And being selfish is often very pro-social because the better you're doing, the more you can help other people, usually. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for showing up and for commenting and chatting and participating and being part of this conversation with me. It really makes me feel good. Selfishly, this feels great. And I think it's going to help people because I think when people listen to this, it will give them a lot of perspectives to consider. So thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to me and the people who listen to this. It helps a lot of people, believe it or not. So if you're out there and you listen to this, please share it with people. Share it with anyone you know who might be in therapy. Share it with anyone who is trying their best to help. So please, 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 please share this. Please get the word out about this podcast. And, if you're not a subscriber, I hope you subscribe. And if you're not following me on Twitter, even if you're not going to follow me, at least come joke around with me. My handle on Twitter is @AlobhaPatrick. This is the Psychology Checkup, and my podcast every week is UnShrink Me. And unfortunately, because we're out of time, no joke for this week, but I got a banger for you next week. And so I hope that you all take very good care of yourselves. Please, please, please eat better, sleep better, and move more. Eat, sleep, exercise. Those 3 things are good for your life. Nobody has them perfect. We can all do better. So please keep taking care of your health. I hope that I see you next week, and